Hello, everyone. I'm Martin Hutchings from the Planning Advisory Service. Welcome back to the fifth episode of In Conversation with Anna Rose, who's the head of Planning Advisory Service, my boss. Hello, Anna.
Hi, Martin.
Excellent. This is our roughly monthly outing where Anna talks to a variety of people from the world of planning and beyond about a variety of topical and newsworthy subjects. And today we give a very warm welcome to James Scott, Group Director of Strategy and Planning at Urban and Civic. Hello, James.
Hi, Martin.
Excellent. So where do I start? James is a qualified barrister, solicitor, as well as being one of the founder members of Urban and Civic. And within Urban and Civic, I think, James, you head up planning and communications. That was the latest thing I read about you. So hopefully I've got that right. So today, while many things in the world of planning are up in the air, still to be decided, Anna and James are going to keep their feet firmly on the ground. And today, they're going to be discussing public space, its use and value when developing sites. So excellent. Looking forward to that. So I'm going to get out of the way and leave you two to chat. And I look forward to your conversation. I'll see you later on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Yes, I think it's most people in the profession who know James and I will know that we've known each other for a fair while now. We first worked together on Halton, or many moons ago, actually. We usually judge this by how old our children are now, in terms of in terms of where we've got to, which in my case is rather depressing. Yes, we had a very good working relationship on that site, and we've remained friends ever since. So it's lovely to have you here, James, and thank you for agreeing to come on. As Martin said, we're going to be discussing space. And James, quite rightly, when I said, shall we discuss space, said to me, so do you mean public open space, or do you mean all space? And so we decided to go ambitious, and we're going to do all space. And that includes community facilities, anything that isn't in your house. I think that's about right, isn't it, James?
I think that's as good a broader definition to start with as we possibly can, depending upon time, though, Anna.
Yeah, we've been told by Martin that we've got to peg it in because we do have a tendency to go off on a tangent. So the first thing that we thought we'd talk about is I suppose where we got this from was I read the Guardian report on Halton because I keep up to date with all things Halton because I only live a mile or two up the road. Very positive article, actually, James. Happy with it?
It was. No, I was really happy with it. And actually, Rowan Moore, is a proper architectural critic. He pulls no punches, and he was incredibly thorough in the preparation for that article. I mean, I haven't, you often get occasional inquiries for journalistic pieces, but Rowan was backwards and forwards, checking, cross-checking, getting the right photos and everything else to go through the piece. And I think the overall sort of impression that he got of Halton, particularly the open space, the community space elements, and the sort of general feel was bang on. And of course, house building at the end of the day, is quite a lot of a matter of personal preference as well. So, it was a really, really balanced, really thoughtful article, and great to see it given that level of exposure by a serious architectural critic, in a national newspaper.
Yeah, I read it and I thought it was very balanced, actually. You know, from knowing the site, from being involved in the planning of the site, I thought it gave a good representation of what it's all about. And so there's also the Quality of Life Foundation report, Sadie Morgan, that you kindly sent over to me, and I've had a read through it. And actually, again, your sites come out really well in terms of quality of life. There are clearly issues, there always are on site. But I think the strengths, as I read them, were very much in terms of the space that's provided on the site.
Yeah, I mean, you're seeing that on a number of different fronts, and the Quality of Life Foundation survey. I mean, all credit to them as an organisation for trying. Firstly, this was actually their sort of initial wide report, and it was on Urban Civic and 3 of our sites and a number of other developers bringing forward sites. But I don't know about you, but we spend oodles of time. You alluded to it at the beginning, as what we got to know each other back in 2013, talking about the planning of a large scale site. What you don't often spend a lot of time doing is talking about the delivery of that site and what's gone right and what's gone wrong. And then also being able to have a sort of an objective exercise which assesses things on a comparative basis, because good organizations want to keep learning. They want to do things better. They don't just want to repeat the same approach, which might have some good elements and some sort of mistakes in it. And so what the Quality of Life Foundation was doing, and what we are genuinely interested in repeating sort of every few years, is getting back in and seeing whether those stats change. So not ask multiple different questions, not change the playing field, just see actually what the progress is for our residents. Because ultimately, although we don't build the houses, the house builders build the houses, the residents on the site are the new community inhabiting and taking ownership of a place. Often the early ones are properly pioneers, because there's, whether it be a Cold War airfield or whether it be a radio station in the Midlands, these were not habited places in the past. So that's going to be the really interesting thing with that. And the findings around open space were incredibly encouraging, and the encouragement with which to get on and do other things which are programmed in and will need to come forward as part of these sites don't just land from space. I don't know about you, but again, a large scale site, so Urban and Civic, big large scale sites, there's always a tendency to talk about them as if they're fully formed on day one. If only that were the case, right? If only that were the case, it would be dead simple to drop everything on day one, but also to tweak and to learn. And there's some nuance in the detailed findings of that report. I mean, I'll give you an example, which is that residents liked the fact that there are benches in the green space. They really did. They want to go out and sit down and enjoy it. Older residents wanted to increase the frequency of the benches, because they were encouraged to go out and have a walk, knowing that they could sit down in various different places, but that sometimes there was a bit too much of a gap between the benches. It's a really simple point, but it changes the quality of enjoyment of a piece of open space and can very easily be built in from the design. Going back and retrofitting is always a little bit more difficult, a bit more costly and everything else. So fascinating, guided nuance as well as big picture from that, and well worth a read. It's on their website, and it's a properly interesting document for anybody doing these sorts of things.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating, actually, all the sites, when you read about all of them. And I thought actually one of the things that struck me was, how many people responded to the survey and how difficult it was to get them to respond. I thought that was quite interesting in itself, because it says a lot, doesn't it? Because, you either get a lot of people responding because they've got something awful to say, and that's probably me having worked in a local government scenario, or you get a lot of people responding because they've got something really good to say about these questions. And I think that's what came across to me, was that there were a lot of people that wanted to say how much they liked living there and for why. And I think that's really powerful, actually.
It is. I mean, I posted that Rowan Moore article on LinkedIn, and one of the comments came back from a resident at Halton and said, one of the best decisions I've ever made moving to Halton. I just love the green space. And so, of course, you get the keyboard warriors come in and with negatives, and that is part of social media life and engaging in that particular world. But at the same time, it is amazing to see those positive elements. And I think one thing that our team is really focused on, which is that if you've got guidance from your residents, and admittedly the sample size was quite small, but people don't buy a home to live in an experiment, they buy a home. If they take the time to fill in that survey, then fantastic. And whatever information they give you in that survey, if you can then go back and engage with the population on the points that are made, and they can see that things evolve over time, and that the sort of next phase of a development properly incorporates those pieces in, then actually you start reinforcing the engagement and the positive engagement. So instead of everybody just crusading in relation to problems, they go, actually, do you know what, if I take the time to put a positive in here, it will get picked up on. Now, you know, we're not, as a business, a landed estate. We're not going to be around forever. And therefore, there comes a time over what, maybe a 15, 20, 25-year cycle of bringing forward a site that you will leave it at a certain point. And then you have to be able to ensure that the management structures, but also the community champions have come forward. And I think that's a really sort of, it's not often discussed in those terms, but you're not curating a community. That would be wrong. What you're doing is you're identifying and encouraging people to come forward and actually engage. And then if those people do so, and then they're sort of, you know, yeah, very interesting, whatever, they go away and they think, oh, I'm not going to bother to do that. Whereas actually over time, if you can build that up, then actually you do have self-sustaining long-term places as well. And landscape, going back to our favorite subject at the moment, but landscape is that wonderful catalyst that's delivered early on, that gets people really interested, really involved. I remember we did a tree planting exercise at Alconbury, and with the local residents who had moved onto the site. And there was this lovely story of this couple that had a little baby boy. They just moved to the site. It was their first big family home. And they came and they planted a tree, and they plopped him sort of on the floor with his back against the tree and took a picture, because that tree is going to be as old as he is in due course, and they will be able to go back and say they put down roots, quite metaphorically and literally, within that community. And so it's a fascinating element, we find, landscape, and in all its forms, because it covers health and well-being, biodiversity, carbon sequestration, you know, fitness, health, you know, but also that sort of wider green piece that people like living amongst trees and amongst landscape. And the days of tightly constrained, highly urban sort of residential developments, which you drive into and then drive around, and you don't really feel that there's landscape in there. You know, I hope we're moving fully away from those. But yeah, it's lovely to see. It's properly lovely to see.
And also, I mean, taking up that why we do it, you know, so why have we moved from, like you say, you know, I know rugby really well, but, you know, some of those tightly packed urban form to something that is quite wide ranging, actually, in terms of its facilities and in terms of how it looks, and it doesn't look overly built up. So why do we do that? Why do we provide, you know, public spaces? I'm thinking, you know, I usually speak in planning language, you know, so we do it because we're told we have to do it usually. But why would you go beyond that? Why would you go beyond what you're told to do?
Yeah, I mean, you know as well as I do, and most of your listeners will have local plans that are sort of set out mandatory requirements for formal and informal open space. And you know, I think if you asked a resident to try and tell you the difference between a formal and informal open space, they might actually struggle until they sort of, you know, they sort of read the definitions. I mean, green space is, as I say, multifaceted in its benefits. There's no doubt about that. The nature and layout of that green space within a site is also, you know, incredibly different. You can have big front pieces in terms of setting scene and creating place. You can have green corridors that run through a site, and Halton's a great example. You know, our beloved Newts, you know, drove a landscape strategy of green corridors that ran through. But those green corridors now give significant green views for a larger number of homes than just if you had a big park at the back of a site, for example, that would only have an elevational detail. So again, that sort of that balance of what's that, the playing fields, the nature reserves, the corridors, you know, all of these different things. You know, why do you do it? Because actually it creates a better, stronger place. But you've really got to be intelligent about the design of the green space as well. And yeah, I'm not, I have to say, you know, over the years, you've seen green spaces turn up on plans and they look very manageable on a plan, but as you and I have debated and discussed many times, scale is the big deceptive element of dealing with large scale sites. And so this big block of green on a plan, you think great, and then you suddenly realize that that's the equivalent of, you know, 14, 15 football fields. And then you think, right, okay, well, it can't, you know, that's quite, you know, difficult, A, to design, B, to sort of, you know, manage in various different elements. And so what about, you know, breaking that up a bit, putting it into more parts of the site, you know, intruding it into the housing, so that instead of people living next to a park, actually people live in a park. And, you know, if it should any developers get to watch this, you know, then you can genuinely say that actually green spaces are value and absorption generative. It's undoubtedly the case that the sites that we're bringing forward, because of the investment in the green spaces, are being regarded as the prime within the areas. You'll know from Halton. And there was not a single house on Halton 6 years ago. It is now identified by agents and across the area as being the prime area to live in terms of the sort of the expansion of rugby, and that, you know, has taken energy and effort. It's been helped in no small measure by the sort of the disciplines driven by our newts, you know, into that landscape. But now an ecology driven landscape is delivering well in excess of 10% biodiversity net gain, which is hitting another, you know, national agenda. And so, you know, we're pretty positive about it. And there was a survey last year. There's a website. I don't know. Are you allowed to mention commercial websites on your? Yeah. Okay. So there was a website. There was a survey called Home Views, and they're, you know, tried to be a bit like a TripAdvisor, and they took a survey of resident views with a sort of 21-point analysis, and the highest rated housing in the country on their survey was the Davidson's housing at Halton, and that is great housing. It's great housing, but you then read the reviews, and it's significantly enhanced by the proximity to and quality of the green space. So, you know, I really do think, you know, that the seeing is believing on these large scale sites. If done properly, you know, the house builders can feel it in terms of market demand, you know, the community can feel it in terms of being able to go and do a, you know, 3-mile walk within the site. You know, the dog owning population on our sites is high because you can go and walk your pet directly from your front door. You don't need to put it in a car and drive to a park to be able to do it. And actually the overall quality of life is higher. So that's why it's worth doing. If you don't believe us because of the altruism, and you know, it's actually about creating great places for us. We always set ourselves out as the ambition to do that, but actually also from a commercial point of view. But you've got to accept that you've got to invest early, and then that will then be paid back over a longer period of time. And you know, it is a case that not all companies' financial models are built that way. So, you know.
Yeah, and I think also that point you made about scale is really important, isn't it? Because yes, you can go too big, but actually I think where we've failed before is going in way too small. So, you know, take ourselves back to Leaps and, you know, where we got these little, you know, penned off parks with one swing and a rocking donkey or something, you know, on the edge of, and I just think back to those sort of developments. And yes, we've learned a lot, haven't we? But there's definitely, scale is so important when you're providing usable space on site. Yeah. Because what you see is those are often just abandoned now. They're you know, they don't serve the purpose. Like you say, the way that the space on the sites in the Quality of Life Foundation survey link up and they provide routes through, and it's about overall mobility, isn't it, rather than that space is for playing, that space is for walking. You know, you can do it all and you can join it up. And I think when I'm reading some of the TCPA reports as well, it's about providing opportunities for everybody to move however much they can. And I think that that's really important when we're looking at site design, and when we're thinking about how much land we provide, where we provide it, and how it links up. And I remember having these discussions when we were looking at the framework for Halton and working out how we would get from that initial outline decision all the way through to delivery on the ground. And when do you bring the house builder in, and how do you ensure that you still get what you thought you'd get at the beginning? And you're the best person to describe the hierarchy of plans. But it's really interesting, isn't it, how you pick up that point. So in planning, we're always dealing really with so communities and councillors' frustration with the planning process, where they think they're getting something at point A, and by the time it gets to you on the ground, it's become something totally different. And I think those discussions we had right at the beginning were trying to get that assurance for the councillors in Rugby that we could decide this here and still get it when we got onto delivery on the ground. And do you want to take the listeners through that? Because I'm not sure my memory is as good as yours.
Oh, sorry, how long did Martin say we had?
Do this quickly, James.
Right, Now, if you're sitting comfortably, I will begin. I mean, look, the philosophy of approaching large-scale sites is fundamentally different than approaching smaller scale sites. You cannot take a 250 unit site mentality and scale it up. You just can't do it. You've got to approach it from a different perspective, because what we found as UNC when we entered the market in 2010 is that there were a lot of large scale sites that were still in planning, and they've been in planning for a very, very long time. And the reason for that was that they were because everybody believed you got your outline consent, and then the next thing people saw were the reserve matters that came forward to implement that outline consent. Not unreasonably, local authority planners went, hang on a second, well, we've got to nail these details down at outline and boil the ocean at the outline, because at that point we'll then have a sufficiently detailed framework for the reserve matters and be able to control it. And look, as wise as we now think we are after doing this for 12 years, we do not understand what's fully round the corner. Who would have predicted the pandemic? Who would have predicted the fact that the argument over whether these are dormitory towns, which was 10, 15 years ago, would be totally eclipsed by an increased focus on local, because people are living and spending more time on them. Right. So anyway, long story short, our approach therefore was this concept or mantra of flexibility is better than prophecy. The idea that you just can't be precise about everything, but you do need to set some broad frameworks at the outline. And then you get this next phase, then this next tier, I call the outline tier 1. And anybody that's been in a room with me has heard this explained before will no doubt be shivering at this point. But that's right. Tier 2 is what we call the key phase. And the key phase will be about 1,000 residential units on average, and it will be part of the site. And at that point, with a key phase, you go from a parameter plan level to a regulatory plan and design code. And within that level of detail, you can actually start being sufficiently precise about fixes. So the alleviation of pressure is at the top level. Planners, local authority, you don't need to nail it all down, because actually there will be a second opportunity to come and have a very meaningful, and in fact probably arguably more meaningful, debate around a level of scale which is 5 to 7 years of delivery. And then fundamentally you'll repeat that process key phase by key phase. Now, why is that important? Well, that's important because the initial engagement on a large-scale consent is with the local authority, it's with the key stakeholders, and it's with the surrounding community. And the surrounding community may or may not be enthusiastic about the idea of development coming forward and on their doorstep. And,
That's generous.
that's yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, they're sort of they might, after speaking to me, be worn down enough to go, actually, do you know what? I've just got to go. I think I left something in the oven. But that's very interesting. But the point being is that you're only talking to those surrounding the site, and when you then engage on the second key phase, actually, you're not just talking to the people who live around the site, you're talking to the people that moved in and inhabited the first key phase. They are now part of your community, arguably the most important part of the community, because the next phase is on their doorstep and they've lived and breathed the decisions that you made collectively with your partners, the local authority, the county council, in the first phase. And they will be very clear as to what's worked and what hasn't worked. That's why the Quality of Life Foundation information is so important. But on a phase-by-phase basis, we go back and reconsult. And so that element of, so the green space, give us a bit more detail, give us a bit more understanding. And so you're improving and you're maturing and you're getting this better and better as you move through. And the reserve matters are then dropping in, and they're coming in from us as master developer, they're coming in from the house builders on the service land parcel, they're coming in from the county council as educational authority, sometimes in relation to the schools, and other elements are sort of fitting into the overall picture. But for us, it's a very real way of engaging. You can't overpromise at the outset because you just don't know the way things are going to go. You don't know the way planning policy is going to evolve. You can't see what's going to be asked of this site in 10 years' time with absolute certainty. And why make a commitment which just to get planning, which ultimately you have to go back and actually have a look at. Now, there are some times you have to do that, but in the main, the idea is to create a flexible framework which enables you to evolve and bring forward developments in a sensible way and respond to opportunities as well as challenges.
And I think there's some things, aren't there, that so when we were planning for that site, we couldn't have imagined that so allotments have a resurgence, don't they? And things like that. So it's like, I was thinking all those old baby names come back, but the facilities that people want actually are on a cycle, aren't they? In terms of how we provide them. I remember being in local government when, we were deciding what to do with all the allotments, because actually nobody wanted them at one point. And now you can't get one for nothing money around here. They're so popular.
And that also extends to community, community spaces, community orchards. That they are. It goes to the point about that multifaceted nature of green space. It is an incredibly strong binding agent within a community because people are out and about and inhabiting it. And whether that's a change, as I say, from this concept of dormitory town to increased focus on local, whether it's an element now also of sort of, climate resilience and sustainability, or that we're, actually just enjoy sort of getting back out and connecting with nature. All of those things are evolving over time. And you're right. I mean, the first set of allotments at Halton, are the level of is very highly oversubscribed. But there will be further ones coming through the development, and you can begin to understand this. And also you can build them in to create areas of activation. So instead of becoming antisocial sort of blighted areas, which is what you're referring to in the past, which is the challenge that they had become, there's people coming and going, and it's about then creating what you said about networks and the ability to, instead of just blocks of green space that are dumped in various different locations, create those pathways through, and then have activation within those pathways. So actually you might have some allotments along one of those pathways, but then that might connect into the cafe. So after a hard day's weeding, you can go and have a cup of tea, or it might actually connect into or be connected with the primary schools that are coming forward. a lovely example on one of our sites where one of the house builders that the school said, you know what, we'd like to have some allotments within our green space.
Oh, that's a great idea.
And one of the house builders said, actually, do you know what, because we're involved with the site and we're involved on an ongoing basis, they sponsored the delivery of the allotments within that school. And we've gone back at Prize Hall and planted an area of the school's grounds with a woodland area, so it can become part of a woodland classroom, because again, curriculum has changed and sustainability is now on the agenda, and people, you know, in a way whereby education authorities really didn't want the management headache and hassle, they're now beginning to say, oh, this is quite interesting, and we need to have this concept of, you know, we've gone whole hog at Wintringham, where actually the school has a classroom in the centre of it, which is a garden, and so it's like an avocado with the stone in the centre, which is open to the elements and planted as a garden, and so the whole school looks into what is the garden classroom, and so you can start having fun with it as well in that sense.
But there's also, and it's like a bit of a chicken and egg, isn't it? What comes first, the space or the community in terms of that? And I love that sort of dynamic, because I think what I've seen on sites is that the people moving in, like you say, are pioneers, and, you know, dealt with this sort of real granular level when I was at Milton Keynes, about pioneers of new places. And you do see that, but they need to feel that they're championing something, don't they? And so I think that it's a real cycle of, you know, so the community gets going in order to direct where the spaces come, and then the community grows from those spaces. So if you're thinking of allotments of the schools, different communities, but they do all come together, don't they? And are they your parish councillors, town councillors of the future, those people that are involved in that local governance, you know?
Yeah, quite possibly. And given the longevity of these schemes, a child that's at a primary school on site could well be coming through into sort of taking a more civic role from 16 to 18, you know, onwards, and taking the views of schools and school children as well is a vitally important element of building large-scale places for the future, because, you know, again, nobody has a monopoly on good ideas. So I'd like to think so.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be lovely if the local politicians coming through the system, were working for rather than against, in terms of, so at the moment what we see obviously is quite a lot of people are going into parish council, town councils, and it's usually a camaraderie around something that they don't want to happen. Wouldn't it be lovely if we had a whole new range of, like you say, the children at the school coming through because they want something to happen, and that's what they're championing? I often think that when I'm looking at the community and space and value and all of that piece. I think,
but that goes full circle though, Anna, to that point about, yes, that is a fair categorization in some instances. But what we're seeing is that the parish councils that are engaged with, and that you know, the surrounding area, actually sort of are, you know, beginning to think, oh, actually there is some really good things coming forward from this, and actually that we, you know, I mean, I was tremendously impressed with, you know, for example, with the Hillmorton Locks, and, you know, the church down by Hillmorton Locks, and you know, the church said, actually, do you know what, we'd like to have a vicarage in the area. Do you think we could, you know, get one of the houses at Halton? And so the vicar for the old parish church at Hillmorton Locks now lives in a purpose-built vicarage, which on the site. And that element of binding in community, whether it be the church or the parish or whatever it may be, and also giving the politicians that were brave enough to back, you know, you as planners in your original local plan, and then on the application that came forward, with the credit, which is that, you know, where they took brave decisions and they backed large scale allocations, and where they said we want to see quality delivered, and quality was delivered, then those politicians should be able to say, yeah, Thank you. I'm really quite proud of what has come forward, and the officers should be in exactly the same position, because you've worked through all of that detail on your local authority side. So this isn't, these sites. People say that they categorize them as urban and civic sites. Actually, as they're coming forward, we might be the name above the door that's pushing them forward from a master developer perspective, but they're not, and they're an outcome of an enormous amount of different contributions from different elements, people being, as I say, brave enough to have their courage of their convictions to make the allocation, to back the application, to then see it come forward. Homes England investing through infrastructure loan finance, which enables us to accelerate the delivery of large bits of infrastructure, such as the link road at Halton. So it's it properly is a team effort, and done properly, and recognizing that it should be everybody's ambition and goal. And I again, I joke with our team slightly, but I was always told when we were starting this business up that you've got to come out to Scandinavia, and you've got to come out to Holland, and you've got to have a look at all of these different examples of developments. I'd like, by the time sort of we're maybe 20 years in, for a whole load of Scandinavian and Dutch architects to be going, I tell you what, we've got to go on a study trip to Halton and see how that's been done, and that's working, and because then that's a proper sort of recognition at that level that the planners, the delivery, the landscape, and everything has something to teach the next generation of sites.
Yeah, and you're right. And I did a sweeping generalisation on local councillors, but that we have seen quite a few incidents of people going on an anti somewhat development around the country. So that's what I was referring to. I suppose when we look at it though, your sites, because they're not in pre-developed areas when you start, don't have councils, do they? They either have to be overseen by a neighbouring council, or they have to await a council, I suppose, coming in. And I think it's really interesting with some of the community stuff that's going on sites as to where the local governance comes in. And if we say just for generally, sites and how they get their governance and whether it's useful or not. I mean, you referred me to Cranbrook, didn't you, to have a look at that report that came through. And I thought some of their findings actually in that report were really interesting, that yes, there's a need for governance, but the timing of it is really critical. And I think with Halton, which obviously I know better than the other sites, but they currently sit under the neighbouring village parish, don't they, at the moment? So that's how it sits. But do you have any view as to when's the right time to bring in? I
personally at the moment don't think that there's a formula at which point you can say, right, you have to have it in by 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it may be. What you want is ultimately successful local governance. That's key, and that will evolve on different sites at different times, at different speeds. It will depend upon whether there's significant employment on a site, in which case actually it's a balance between a resi and employment location, and government needs to reflect accordingly. So I equally, and this is where I have a little bit of a sort of a bugbear, is that you're seeing large-scale public organisations retrench from adoption of public spaces. Now, there's a cost reason. I understand that, but at the same time, that retrenchment from a cost perspective is in effect retrenching from a democratic wrap that comes with that sort of taking ownership, whether it be a road, a playground, a piece of green space, a community building, and consequently, as master developers of large scale sites, what you need to do is you do need to have a meanwhile structure that works, and which is enabling of the house builders ultimately to sell the homes to, or rent the homes or affordable housing providers to take responsibility for their homes, and know that the roads will be maintained, the grass verges will be sort of looked after, that you won't have a situation whereby people are living on something where there's no funding available to deal with that. And the reality from a retrenchment approach is that the other obvious sort of stepping stone initially is for the creation of the management company and for the management charge, which goes on each home to contribute to the overall cost. Now, on a large scale development, because that is building up over time, you can't just put the whole cost onto the early residents. So actually you then end up subsidizing that management cost in the early days. But you've got to have a mind that, as I say, we're not a long-term estate owner. So you've got to have a mind that ultimately, the income's going to balance the expenditure. You can't design something which is going to generate enormous demands on management and maintenance expenditure. So you can't get capability Brown in to do the landscape, for example, because it'll cost too much to maintain. So there's a balance. You've also got to find income generating options for green spaces, landscape spaces. You've got to be prepared to create those cafes in those locations. You've got to be prepared to put community buildings. I mean, one of the very successful community buildings at Alconbury is actually the cricket pavilion, which is on the cricket pitch. Now, that building is in use almost every hour of every day, and sometimes it's a cricket pavilion, but it's not sitting there as a cricket pavilion and then people are looking at it. It's designed as a community space which then can come in, and over time all of those things go into the pot. And as I say, we haven't left a site yet in our evolution as an organization, but we are going to have to balance it. Now, what was interesting about Cranbrook was they adopted the same model, and there's a lot to learn from Cranbrook, both in terms of what went well and what didn't go so well, but the heart within the organization, particularly within the local authority, to try and get that to work was very strong.
You could tell, actually.
You can tell, couldn't you, in that report? And again, I don't know whether you have the opportunity to make that report available. It's a public available document. It's on their website, and it's a really thoughtful view of a site 10 years on. And what had happened there is that a parish council had been formed because the community had come together. It had said, we're Cranbrook, we're going to have our own parish council, and the management charge had given way to a parish precept. And as a result, instead of the equation of you own a home, you get a vote, actually it was everybody who lived within that home who was capable of voting could vote within the parish council. And that's quite attractive. I mean, and if you see that sort of, groundswell coming forward, you've got to be able to manage it, nurture it, sort of, and then facilitate it as it comes through in the lifespan of a large scale site. But equally knowing that for some reason, if people just, I'm just going to pay my monies and takes my choice, that there will be a management company that's capable of delivering it as well as the baseline, and then anything else can evolve over time.
And I suppose those aren't the only two options either. Depending on the scale, then you have trusts, you have, so there's all sorts of ways, aren't there, of managing this. But I think it's quite clear at the moment that the tried and tested route of the local council doing it is not the one that is being taken up most often now. I think that's what we're saying. And so arrangements like at Cranbrook might be, what some of the futures of some of these sites that are non-parished at the moment. I just think that's quite interesting. I wanted to just air that for
I'd be really interested in, in the sense of a quid pro quo, if there are other examples that your listeners know about, you think are useful and valuable from both a good and bad perspective, let us know, because it's a properly open debate at the moment.
And then it will further better provision of public spaces if there is a long-term maintenance and stewardship of them. you know.
Yeah.
So one leads to the other, really, doesn't it? People aren't going to take that risk if they think that there's, you know, that there's no way of funding it into the future. So I think that it's one of those. The other thing that I suppose I hear a lot of, and we have had this chat, James, about is trees. So tree planting. So this comes up a lot. You know, I sit on the Office of Place Advisory Board. We talk about trees a lot. We talk about trees in local government a lot. And they seem to be a real problem in terms of provision. So street tree planting just seems to be one of those things that is more difficult than it sounds. Would that be about right?
Yes, in a short answer. The slightly longer answer is, and it goes back to this adoption point.
Yeah.
If local authorities may have design policy which encourages the provision of street trees, I don't know how many of those local authorities have had the same discussion with the county council as highway authority in terms of that sort of adoption, you know, or in terms of the provision of street trees.
Yeah.
Because the practical reality is that in most instances there is no specific requirement to provide street trees. The easy answer is not to provide street trees. The highway, and again, you know, not always the case, but the preferred route from a number of highway authorities that we deal with is that they just will never adopt street trees.
Yeah.
And so we have on a number of our sites this slightly bizarre plan, which is that because we believe in street trees, right? We fundamentally believe in them. And actually, if you drive around a place with street trees and you drive around a place without street trees, you notice the difference. In fact, I think I told you the story about the taxi driver I took from Rugby Station into Halton, and bless him, you know, the way he categorized Halton as being the posh bit was because there were a lot of street trees, right? And I mean, okay, I mean, you know, but that was completely unprompted, and that's just an instinctive reaction. But if you're a highway authority, what you really care about is highway safety, highway maintenance, lighting, visibility displays, and you know, I may well be a number of highway officers may well be shouting at their screens listening to this, but ultimately street trees. You know, if somebody pushes you far enough to say we'd like to bring forward some street trees. Now, there are two reactions to that. One is the highway authorities we're dealing with say, if you want street trees, we're not adopting them. And we end up with these bizarre plans, as I was saying, which if you think of purple as adopted, the road and the footpath are ultimately adopted, and then white as being the non-adopted bit. There are little slithers, little lozenges that sort of then, you know, quite long strips actually of white between the two purple, which are the verges. And in those verges, there are the planting of the trees, and they are not adopted. So you've got this slightly bizarre scenario whereby ultimately you've got a highway authority protecting the road and the footpath, and then the management company or whoever ultimately takes long-term responsibility is responsible for maintaining the verge and the tree planting. Other authorities will adopt them, but they come with the requirement for a commuted sum on a per tree basis. And we're seeing anything from £1,000 to £3,000 per tree in that context. Okay, so if you're planting 200 trees, that's not an inconsiderable amount, and it goes into the overall viability of the scheme. Now, you know, how long that commuted sum actually, how much of that commuted sum, maybe being a little bit cynical, goes into a long-term coffer for the maintenance of those, or how much of it just goes into the general budget is a, you know, is an open question.
But also, James, it also brings into mind, is it to protect the highway from the tree, or is it to look after the tree?
Well,
because that's you know, a lot of my colleagues tell me that, you know, a lot of the trees that are built in the highway are really poorly planted, and so they will need a lot more maintenance. But a commuted sum to the highways department seems like it might protect the highway rather than the tree.
I mean, it's technically, it's there. It is there in order to say, right, responsibility for the long-term management, maintenance, and indeed potential replacement of that tree is now passed to the highway authority. And, you know, in the same way that we would be responsible if a tree dies for replacing that tree, then, you know, that should fall upon the highway authority. But you're right. I mean, that's why I think highway authorities now are basically twin tracking with the sort of planning, the technical specifications, because you're right. I mean, nobody wants a whole load of poorly planted trees whose root systems then go and undermine the road system, which then increases unnecessarily the cost on the public purse. But let's just assume, right, you have created a proper root ball protection system. You've planted the tree. There's sufficient protection. It's a species that is not going to suck out all the water from, you know, a clay base, and therefore, you know, you're going to end up with sort of a long-term manageable tree. As I say, there are some highway authorities that just say, even on that basis, no, we don't want anything to do with them. And you've got to therefore be quite determined. The reason I answered your question yes is that if you believe that street trees are good for amenity, they're good for solar shading, they're good for you know, the appearance of a scheme, the quality, the sense of quality of that scheme, then you have to push through that treacle to make sure that actually either you're putting them in to adoptable standards and having a budget to be able to allow them to be adopted, if that's your choice, or you're putting them in and you're then factoring the long-term management cost of them into the management company. Now, our view is that people attach a disproportionate value to having boulevards of, you know, and Nick Boy Smith and I, you know, fully agree on the importance of tree planting along roads. You know, you feel like you're entering a proper mature place. And equally, 20 years time, you know, I love those photos, the comparable photos of, you know, now and, you know, 20 years ago, and you see that place evolving and growing, and I think they're worth pursuing. But, you know, I mean, you also have the same, you know, house builders know the same challenge, because NHBC have a series of rules, this National House Building Certificate, you know, in order to be able to sell the home, if you know, are planting a tree too close, it's then got to be in a root balling system and everything else. And there are various different standards. The easy thing is not to plant the tree.
Yeah, and that's what that's sort of the shame of it all, isn't it? Is that it is the easiest thing is not to do it because it's made so difficult. I was walking around a town centre scheme that had trees in it, and I, you know, I commented to the development manager. I said, it shouldn't be so unusual, should it, to see trees in a town centre scheme? But it was all hard paved, and it was, you know, so it was really nicely done. But if it hadn't had that green in it, it would have looked really stark, you know, like really, really stark. So even if you were just taking the aesthetics, then without those trees lining that pedestrian way, it just wouldn't have looked right, I don't think. But apparently the battle to get them in was huge, you know, absolutely huge. And actually the colleagues I was with were saying, you know, we could have done with green roofs and things like that. And you could see the development manager thinking, I don't think I've got that many years left in my life to get that sort of stuff, you know. And actually it just shouldn't be that difficult, should it? Right. Given where we are with climate change and carbon reduction and things, it shouldn't be difficult.
So really this is a cart and horse type question, right? What do you prioritize? What do you say, right, is mandatory, and then everything else flows through? I'll give you another, for instance, which always amazes me. But in a world whereby local authorities and county councils are declaring climate emergencies and the plans are then following, we still have a manual for sort of highways and bridges which does not prioritize the use of recycled material over new material in the base course of roads, for example. And so it has been a challenge to persuade highway authorities in that instance to actually say, come on, if we want to reduce the embedded carbon within this road, we need to turn that on its head. And you need to say, show us how you're going to use recycled material of the appropriate quality. And if you can't, use new material, right? And it's that sort of inversion. And there are some, pardon the pun, green shoots in this regard, because you are beginning to see that change. You are beginning to see that understanding. But at the same time, there are a series of embedded hurdles within our system, which are not there for bad reasons. They're just long-standing. Highway safety is vitally important. That is absolutely right. But at the same time, so is the concept of having a tree-lined boulevard on people's health and well-being. And you know what? If you've got a tree-lined boulevard, you may find that people think, it might be a nice walk. I'll just walk over there rather than I'll get in the car and drive through this tarmac landscape. So again, we come back to those routes through a site and how green infrastructure doesn't need to be one big lump and then thank you very much. It's actually about the intelligent, clever ways in which you play with its applicability in the form of space, and usable space, and space which then meets a wide variety of requirements and obligations, and placemaking criteria.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I will. Yeah, I'm hoping to see more and more trees in terms of developments, but I'm just not convinced how easy that's going to be. So I'm going to try and share your optimism about this in terms of where we're going. I think we've probably got to a point where I'm going to have to sum up, actually, in terms of...
I'm looking forward to this, Anna.
Yeah. So I think that, what we found from the reports that have been done is that residents really value the spaces that exist outside their homes, and I think the pandemic has probably brought that really to the front of people's minds in terms of where they live and where they choose to live. And I think, although I think from reading the quality of life, the survey results, I think people do tend to focus on what they haven't got rather than what they have. And I always think about that because talking to teams in local government, and I will often say people do have a tendency to focus on the negative. You have to assume the positives in terms of this. So I thought I'd just bring that in as well. I think that the provision of good public spaces brings about social cohesion. I think I have seen that in terms of the sites that I know well that have got good space, that the community grows around them. And I think it's because people go outside, and I think it's that they meet each other and they form relationships that then bring them to common goals. So I think that the one does lead to the other and it drives the other. And I think that's really good. I think that, planning for dual use is really important. So we've talked about, how the newts led to these walkways and how flood remediation areas then provide that expansive space in developments, suds, all of those sort of things. And I think that the dual use of spaces is going to be really important. Your cricket pavilion, that is a community building, the schools that let out their space to the communities. I think these are going to become more and more important as we go forwards and making those arrangements. I don't think we can ignore money and maintenance. Whatever your governance arrangements are, you have to think those through. And I think when we were talking about tiers of decision making, actually the governance, thinking through the governance and how things are going to be paid for follows a similar route. That's not what we did through the planning system, but it's definitely a thought process for the master developer, the planners, and also the local politics in the area to think through what's going to happen longer term and legacy and sustainability. And I suppose my last point is that, my experience is that actually putting the effort into making sure that public spaces are plentiful and are of high quality really reaps the rewards that you want to see from sites. And, you know, I'll own it now. My sister lives on Horton, you know, so I have first-hand knowledge of how that site works, the community endeavours, what things work for her, which things don't. And actually, it's a very positive view. And I think that having seen that, I think, you know, I can see how all the effort that was put in at the beginning into the planning of that site has really paid off. And I think that's a really good endorsement, actually, for you, James. I don't know, you hear me say it so often that you've probably got sort of used to it. But I think the fact that, you know, I worked on the original planning permission, signed it off, and now I have my sister living there and I've got the lived experience of it. And I still think it is a really good model for planning and of what you should do on a site. And I think that is a really good endorsement, actually.
I'm very pleased you say that, because I have to say, you know, spin it round the other way. And as a developer with sort of dealing with the head of planning, who then goes on to become the head of PAS, and who gets her sister to move onto the site to monitor the delivery of the development. I mean, you know, that's proper commitment, Anna. That's proper commitment. But
I don't think she'd like it that I forced her to move there. She's my big sister. I think we'll leave that she's independently minded.
Completely independently minded, but certainly keep an eye on us. I mean, look, at the end of the day, bringing forward these large scale sites and doing it in a way which is positive and which engenders sort of pride in, as I say, those that were involved in the original decision, and seeing how that then flexes through and staying involved with it and going back and having a look and having those totemic examples of success that we can point to say, when the going gets tough, no, actually, do you know what? Let's just push on. Let's just keep going. Let's stay focused on mission and make it happen and make it work. Because ultimately, seeing is believing. And I've got a genuine hope, and it might be naive, but a genuine hope that the challenges that people throw at the possibility of a large-scale scheme coming forward in their area versus, you know, 20, 30 smaller scale schemes. Actually, if you come and have a look at a large scale scheme done well, wherever that may be around the country, and you realize that scheme pulls together not only just the homes requirement, but also the green space, the school provision, the community provision, the sustainable routes, and the energy and effort that goes into doing that as an ongoing partnership with the local authority, with the county council, with the stakeholders, both old and new, that actually, if it can be made to work, then these are the right things to be doing. And they're a bit heavier lifting up front there, and you've got to have a lot of confidence in that. But actually, the seeing is the believing. It's, you know, moving through, and that therefore local plans, which, you know, a number are stalled around the country at the moment on housing numbers and whatever it may be. But when they're looking at then, right, what is the number we bring forward? We'll say, right, we need to start thinking about this in a holistic view, and look what can be achieved. And as you can see from the grins on our faces, from having sort of, been in touch over so many years, we've had a lot of fun doing this as well, right? And it's been, and God, there have been some challenges, but at the same time, it has been enormous fun, and it's been, one of the great sort of privileges of my life to work with committed local authority officers and members that, and I put them up in the sort of hero category, that have literally just grabbed these things and said, okay, we're going to have to take a deep breath, but we're going to go through it, and we're going to frame this as the best possible way we can. And then we're not going to just sit on our laurels with planning, permission issued. Where they're going to push for the delivery, and we're going to see that delivery come through, and we're going to find the ways of ironing out the wrinkles and the challenges, whether they be street trees or otherwise, and keep going. That's what we got into this sector to be able to do, make a difference, see positive impacts coming forward on the landscape. And it's great that it also builds friendships and long-lasting bonds that sort of that go through. So anyway, thank you for having me today, Anna.
No, you're very welcome.
Chat.
Yes, you're very, very welcome, and thank you for coming and talking to me like this. What I would say to the people who are listening to this is, if you're working in the council, I think planners very rarely talk about the schemes that they think have gone really well, and their role in it. And I would encourage you to do so. I think that it's great to have pride in the things that you think have gone really well, because you will be told too often the things that haven't gone well. So please do come and speak about it. And like James said earlier in the conversation, if you've got examples of where things have worked well in terms of governance, in terms of provision, any of those things, let us know, and we can try and highlight those in some of our work and on our website. So thank you for listening today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Martin, as always, for doing everything technical. And I hope you all have a lovely week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.